Welcome to the Explainer. All right, so today we're diving into the moon, but, not just as that big rock in the sky. We're going to look at it through the lens of alchemy, as a kind of diagnostic tool for our own minds.
See, in alchemy, the moon isn't really out there, it's in here. It's this part of our consciousness that acts like a mirror, right? It reflects the world back to us. But here's the kicker. What happens when we completely forget we're just looking at a reflection? What if we start believing that the image in the mirror is the real thing?
And this quote, it just nails it. It's all about that shift from seeing things through a glass darkly, a distorted, reflected view, to seeing reality face to face, super clear and direct. And that right there is the alchemical work of the moon. It's all about polishing the mirror of our minds until it reflects everything perfectly.
Okay, so to really wrap our heads around this, we've got to dig into the symbol itself. Why the moon? What is it about this big rock in space that makes it such a perfect metaphor for how our own minds work? Well, it really all boils down to a super simple fact from astronomy. The sun, it generates its own light, right? It's a powerhouse. But the moon, it's just a dead rock. It doesn't create any light. The only reason it seems to shine is because it's bouncing the sun's light back at us.
And that right there is the perfect analogy for two parts of our own consciousness. You've got this deep, direct awareness, let's call that the sun. It's the pure source of knowing. And then you have the thinking mind, the part that's always chattering away. That's the moon. It doesn't create awareness on its own. It just borrows the sun's light to think, to analyze, to categorize, and, to judge everything we experience.
So this reflective cognition, and in some Eastern traditions they call it vijnana, it's basically that constant narrator inside your head. You know the one. It takes the raw, unfiltered data of life and immediately starts spinning a story, slapping on labels like good, bad, right, wrong. Look, it's a super important tool for getting by in the world, for sure, but we have to remember it's not the source of the light it's using.
Okay, check this out. This table really breaks it down for us. Just look at the source row. One is derivative. It borrows. The other is self-luminous. It just shines. Now here's the really crucial part. Look at error. Direct awareness, the sun, just sees what is. It can't be fooled. But reflective cognition, the moon, it makes a huge error, and it makes it all the time. It constantly mistakes its own thoughts for reality itself. Have you ever caught your own mind doing that?
So what's the big deal? What actually happens when we start believing our reflections are real? Well, this leads us straight to the core problem. The source material calls it the cognitive fall, and it's basically a perceptual trap that gets us stuck in a cycle of suffering. Now, this is so important. This isn't about being a bad person. It's not a moral failing at all. It's more like a perceptual glitch that's just hardwired into the system. Think of it like this. The mind projects a movie onto the screen of reality, completely forgets it's the one running the projector, and then it starts reacting to all the drama up on the screen as if it's actually happening out there.
And what does that create? Well, it's like we're trapped in a psychological hall of mirrors. We spend our entire lives fighting with, arguing with, and running away from reflections that we ourselves have cast. It's wild. And this endless cycle of action and reaction, that's what many Eastern traditions call samsara, the wheel of suffering. Here's a really simple way to get it. Think of karma as an echo. So step one, an echo from something you did in the past comes back, maybe as a feeling of pain or pleasure. Step two, we don't recognize it as an old echo. We mistake it for something brand new happening to us right now. So step three, we react. We shout back at it, with anger or with craving. And then step four, by shouting back, we've just created a brand new echo. And that new echo is guaranteed to come back later, keeping the whole cycle going. Which of course brings us to the biggest question of all. If we're stuck in this echo chamber that we built ourselves, how in the world do we get out? How do we finally stop shouting at the echoes?
Well, the answer lies in what the alchemists call the work. And it's not about fighting your mind, not at all. It's about cultivating this really deep inner stillness. It's about letting the choppy, turbulent waters of your mind just settle, so you can finally see the reflection for what it really is.
And to do this work, the alchemist basically has two main tools in their toolkit. The first one is sati, which you probably know as mindfulness. It's just the ability to observe those returning waves of karma, those echoes, without getting totally swept away by them. The second tool is upekkha, or equanimity.
This is that deep inner balance that lets you just endure the echo, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, without reacting. You just let it pass without adding any more drama, any more turbulence to the water.
And what happens is, as all that reactivity starts to settle down, the mind can enter these really deep states of meditative absorption. They're called jhana. But, and this is key, these states aren't the final goal themselves. It's better to think of them like a controlled laboratory. They create an environment where the mind gets so quiet, the water gets so incredibly still, that the difference between the real light and the mere reflection becomes just completely obvious. You can't miss it.
So what happens then, when the echoes finally fade and the water is perfectly still? What emerges is this totally new quality of consciousness. It's like your confused perception gets transformed, transmuted into this cool, clear light. And that is the payoff for all that patient inner work.
They call this the silver light. And no, it's not the blinding gold of full-on enlightenment. Not yet. Think of it more as a cool, nighttime clarity. It's the wisdom that lets you see your thoughts and your feelings for exactly what they are. Just beautiful, shifting clouds passing in front of the moon. They're there, but they're ultimately empty of any solid, independent reality. You don't get fooled by them anymore.
You know, this quote really gets at the paradox of this whole process. The power you gain here doesn't come from fighting or trying to control your inner world. It's made perfect in weakness. And by weakness, we mean a kind of receptive stillness, a radical acceptance that just lets the reflections be what they are without us messing with them. That is the real strength of the alchemist.
And so we're left with this one final, big question to chew on. Is your mind a fortress that needs to be defended at all costs? Are you using it to build up your identity and your opinions? Or could it be a foundation to be investigated? Can we learn to use this incredible, reflective mind to see the mirror as a mirror? And maybe, just maybe, finally see reality face to face?
All right, let's get right into it. When you hear the word alchemy, you probably think about turning lead into gold, right? But what about the white stone? It's one of the tradition's most powerful symbols, and it's usually seen as some kind of magical prize. Well, in this explainer, we're going to pull that myth apart and find out what it really means.
You know, this one verse from the book of Revelation, this is where so much of the mystery really comes from. It talks about this personal, secret, and profound reward for the one who is victorious. And I mean, it sure sounds like a physical object, doesn't it? Like a tangible trophy at the end of some spiritual quest.
And yeah, that's how most people see it. The white stone is this object of power that you get after a long, hard-fought battle, something you can acquire and own. But looking at it that way, well, you miss the entire point of the alchemical process.
So let's just flip this whole thing on its head for a second. What if the victory isn't about getting something? What if the stone isn't a thing at all, but actually a description of a new kind of consciousness, a totally new way of experiencing reality itself?
And that brings us to the first really big idea here, a mind made clear. This is where we leave the myth behind and get into the practical function behind this amazing symbol.
Okay? This right here, this is the crucial distinction that changes everything. You don't get the white stone. It's not another item to add to your collection of spiritual trophies. It's a state you arrive at, a quality you actually come to embody.
So here's the more, let's say, technical, alchemical definition. It's a mind that has cooled, meaning it's not all fired up anymore by constantly wanting this and hating that. It has clarified, all the mud and confusion has finally settled. And because of that, it can reflect the world as it actually is, without immediately twisting everything through the lens of our own fears and desires.
Think about it like this. Imagine your mind is a perfectly clean, clear surface. It's not projecting its own stories onto every single thing that happens anymore. Instead, it just receives what's there, simply and without distortion. This is a fundamental shift from a mind that projects to a mind that receives.
Now, getting to this state of clarity, it comes with a really subtle, really powerful danger. Just when you think you're making real progress, you can fall into what the alchemists call the trap of virtue. Let's break down these two different paths. On one side, you've got the alchemist path of purification. The goal isn't to be good, it's just to get clear. The method is to remove all the mental junk that's in the way. The result is real insight, but it carries a risk of becoming kind of dry or detached. Now, on the other side, you've got the path of saintliness. The goal here is totally different. It's about merit or a reward in heaven.
The method is to accumulate virtues and good deeds. And that can feel great for sure, but it's often temporary. And the biggest risk is pride, getting trapped by how good you think you are. And this idea of golden chains, man, it is so crucial. It's like you finally break free from the iron chains of your old bad habits, only to slap on a new set of golden chains, your new spiritual identity. You get attached to being the good person or the pure one, and that attachment, it's just another trap.
So the difference couldn't be clearer, really. The saint can get attached to the identity of being a good person. The alchemist, though, isn't interested in an identity. They're more like a technician of the mind, totally focused on understanding the mechanism of how things work.
Okay, so if this isn't about collecting virtue points, how does this clarified mind actually function in the world? How does it have any effect? Well, it all comes down to the power of stillness.
Just look at how this plays out. A normal, reactive mind encounters something, let's say anger, and boom, it immediately reacts. It escalates the situation, just throwing more fuel on the fire. But the alchemical mind, the white stone, it encounters that exact same anger. But instead of reacting, it just absorbs and understands the energy. And without any fuel, the fire just goes out.
And that's why, from the outside, it can look like some kind of healing is happening. But, and this is key, it's not an active process. The alchemist isn't doing anything to the other person. Their own internal stillness just creates this space where confusion and hostility have nowhere to go, no hooks to latch onto. So they just burn themselves out. You know, there's this amazing line from the Tao Te Ching that just nails it. You don't fix muddy water by stirring it up more, right? You just let it be still, and all the sediment naturally settles to the bottom. The mind works the exact same way.
And as this stillness really starts to stabilize, certain really deep-seated mental habits, what some traditions call fetters, they just begin to loosen up on their own. For instance, that rigid belief in a permanent, separate me starts to soften. That constant impulse to run away from pain and chase after pleasure begins to lose its grip. The chains don't break because you forced them to, they just fall away because you finally stopped gripping them so tightly.
But, and I really can't stress this enough, this profound state of clarity, the white stone, is not the end of the journey. It's a resting place, a viewpoint for sure, but it is not the final summit.
Now, this doesn't mean you become some perfect being who never gets irritated again. Oh, you still do. The real difference is in the recovery time. A disturbance that might have thrown you completely off balance for days or even weeks before, now might just last a few minutes before clarity returns. Your whole system just recalibrates itself way faster.
But here's where it can get dangerous. If you mistake this station for the final destination, if you cling to this silence and this purity, the beautiful silver of this stage can start to tarnish. It can become a cold, sterile indifference, a detachment that's totally disconnected from the warmth of life.
And this gives us a wonderfully practical way to measure this. The strength of your mind isn't about being unshakable like a rock. It's about resilience. It's all about how quickly and how gracefully you can come back to your center after being knocked off it.
So, the white stone, it represents a monumental achievement, a clear, non-reactive mind. It's a truly profound piece. But what this explainer shows us is that the journey, it's never really over, is it? It leaves us with a critical question for the next stage of the work. What happens when that life-giving silence begins to harden into stone?
Okay, let's dive right into one of the heaviest, most complicated emotions we deal with as humans, shame. And I'm not talking about just being embarrassed for a moment. We're talking about that deep, structural wound that can really define our whole lives. So together, we're going to explore how it's built and, way more importantly, how we can actually find some lasting relief from it. This line, right? It's so famous. It paints this picture of a kind of psychological innocence. It's not really about clothes. It's about a total lack of self-consciousness, a state of being where the idea of being judged doesn't even exist yet. It's a really powerful way to imagine what a world without the weight of shame might feel like.
And there it is. That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? How do we get from that state of just being to the world we all live in, where shame feels like it's just baked into the human experience? Let's start breaking that down.
To really get to the bottom of this, we have to start by kind of redefining what shame even is. Because, as you're about to see, it's probably not what most of us think it is.
So, here's the crucial point. The second you create an idea of me, a separate, solid self, you've automatically created something that can be attacked, something that can be judged, and something that can be found lacking.
Shame, then, isn't some kind of moral failure. It's a built-in side effect of having an identity in the first place. Think of it like the alarm system for a self that feels like it's under threat. So let's think about that story from Eden, not just as a religious text, but as a surprisingly accurate psychological map of this exact process, the fall into having a separate identity. And this is where the whole story gets a new frame. The nakedness that Adam and Eve suddenly notice isn't about their bodies. It's the raw, shocking vulnerability of having a self. The moment there's a me who is experiencing the world, well, that me is now exposed, out in the open and vulnerable. And that deep anxiety that comes with it, that is the absolute root of existential shame.
Okay, this next part is maybe the single most practical and important tool in this entire explainer. If you're going to get a handle on shame, we absolutely have to be able to tell it apart from its much healthier cousin, guilt.
And this, right here, just nails the core difference. It's the huge leap from talking about your behavior to attacking your identity. Guilt says, I did something wrong. It's specific. You can fix it. But shame says, I am something wrong. It feels permanent, total, and like there's no way out. One is a helpful signal. The other is a life sentence.
And you can see how this plays out. Look at the result of guilt. It leads to positive things like remorse, repair, and adjusting your behavior. It's functional. It helps you grow. But shame? It just leads to hiding, or freezing up, or getting defensive. It's paralyzing because, hey, if the problem is me, what could I possibly do about it? Guilt is a tool for learning, shame is a cage.
Now, what happens when that cage of shame becomes just too painful to live in? Well, the mind can pull off this desperate move. It builds what looks like the exact opposite of shame, but is actually its hardened, toxic twin.
So let's be clear, shamelessness is not freedom from shame. It's a state of total all-out war against it. It's like building a fortress around yourself that's so thick that no criticism, no feedback, no reality, and certainly no responsibility can ever get in. It's a complete refusal to ever be vulnerable again.
In this state is really, really dangerous. It might look strong on the outside, but it's incredibly brittle because it depends on constantly pushing away what's actually true. You know, ancient psychological systems even had these precise terms for it, a hierarcha and a natapapa. Basically, a lack of conscience and a complete fearlessness of doing the wrong thing. It's a trap that's disguised as invincibility.
So, if shame is a cage and shamelessness is a fortress, what's the real way out? Well, the source material we're looking at offers a really powerful antidote, but it involves redefining a very old word: grace.
This is the absolute heart of the solution. Grace, in this way of thinking, isn't something that's handed down to you from on high. It's a psychological insight. It's the profound sense of relief that comes when you truly see that the self that shame is attacking, well, it isn't a solid, permanent thing at all. It's just a temporary collection of thoughts, feelings, and habits. You can't land a fatal blow on a cloud. And this quote just captures the feeling perfectly. As long as you believe there's this solid me that you have to protect 24/7, you are always on guard. But the moment you see through that illusion, even for a second, there's a release. A space just opens up. That feeling of relaxation, that space to finally breathe, that is grace.
Now, a totally normal fear here is to think, wait, if I let go of this solid self, won't I just become irresponsible and not care about anything? But what's so wild is that the exact opposite turns out to be true.
This insight kicks off this incredible chain reaction. First, shame's attack on your identity just fizzles out. Then, all that energy you were using to defend your ego is suddenly free. So now, instead of hiding, you can look clearly at what happened and make things right. Not to prove you're a good person, but just to correct the harm. It becomes simple and practical.
And this new perspective can't help but extend how you see other people. When you understand the conditioned patterns that led to your own mistakes, you start seeing them everywhere. You stop seeing bad people and you start seeing confused human beings caught in the exact same machinery of conditioning. Now, this doesn't excuse harmful actions, not at all, but it replaces hot judgment with a kind of cool, clear-eyed, and functional compassion.
So it really all comes down to this one question. What actually happens when we shift our focus from desperately defending a fragile idea of self to simply understanding the impersonal processes that are playing out through us? It's a huge shift in perspective, and it might just be the key that unlocks the prison of shame and opens the door to what real responsibility feels like.
All right, let's get into it. You know, we often think of our inner work as this big, epic battle against some pretty obvious enemies. But what happens when the fight gets way subtler? What happens when the enemy starts looking a whole lot like an angel? We all know this picture, right? The classic struggle against our inner demons. You know the ones. Rage, craving, that nagging doubt. They're loud, they're heavy, and honestly, they're pretty easy to spot. This is basically battlefield number one on any real path of self-development. But here's the twist. What if, after you've managed to quiet all that noise, the biggest trap isn't something dark and monstrous at all? What if it's something that feels luminous, clear, maybe even enlightened? So this brings us to a much more advanced stage of the journey. Let's call it the alchemist's path. You've been doing the work, you've made some real progress, and those old, obvious chains have started to loosen up. See, when what some traditions call the gross fetters start to fade, that's not the end of the road, not even close. It's actually the beginning of a whole new, much more refined challenge. The silence they leave behind, well, it reveals a whole new landscape of obstacles. And this is where we meet a totally new kind of enemy. And believe me, this one is way more seductive. This is the rise of what you could call the spiritual ego. In the source material, they're called Skandha Demons. Now, let's be super clear. We are not talking about monsters with horns and tails. These are internal patterns. They're structured distortions of your own mind that are so coherent and so convincing, they feel like genuine revelations. They're like mistaking a perfect reflection for the real thing. And this is where the contrast really hits you. Just look at the difference here. The old demons, they come from raw instinct, right? They feel heavy, dark, confusing. Their trap is super basic. I want this. But the new demons? Oh, they're different. They actually come from partial insight, from spiritual ambition. They feel luminous and clear. And their trap? It's so much more subtle. I am this. And this really gets to the heart of the danger. The most seductive obstacles aren't born from being confused or ignorant. No, they're born from real moments of insight that then get grabbed onto and identified with, all because that one key ingredient is missing from the recipe: humility. So how in the world does this trap even work? How does a genuine moment of clarity become a prison? Okay, let's break down the mechanism. It really happens in 3 steps. First, you have a real experience, a flash of insight, a feeling of deep unity. It's totally genuine. But then, step 2, the ego, that sense of I, rushes in and claims it. It whispers, hey, I did this, I am this, I'm enlightened. And then, in step 3, that perception gets misinterpreted as personal authority. And boom, a spiritual ego is born. And this one is much tougher to deal with, because it uses spiritual experiences as its armor. You know, this quote from Daniel Boorstin just hits the nail on the head. At this stage of the game, the real danger isn't being confused, it's being absolutely certain that you've got it all figured out. That illusion of having arrived is the biggest obstacle to actually moving forward. Now, these traps take some very specific forms, which ancient traditions identified as the 5 higher fetters. Let's just look at a couple to see how sneaky they are. There's one called mana. It's not, loud arrogance. It's that quiet, subtle feeling that you're just a little bit more advanced, a little better than everyone else. But the root of them all is avijja, which is the most fundamental delusion of all, the idea that there's even a solid self here to attain anything in the first place. All 5 just point to the ways we grab at experiences to build a shiny new identity. And make no mistake, this isn't just some philosophical game. Acting from these distorted states has very real consequences. This quote is a powerful reminder that whatever we dwell on, well, that's what shapes our reality and our actions. When a real insight gets hijacked by identity, our intentions get all twisted, and we can create some pretty heavy karma, even when we started from a place of genuine insight. So, what's the way out? If even our own insights can turn into traps, what on earth is the antidote? Well, surprisingly, it's not some complicated new technique. It's actually something much, much simpler. This is it. This is the core instruction. Don't identify with anything. Not the blissful states, not the profound insights, not the feelings of divinity. You see them, you appreciate them, and then you let them pass right on by, without building an identity around them. William Blake said it so beautifully. When you try to grab onto a joyful or profound experience, you basically kill it. You destroy its winged life. The real key is to kiss the joy as it flies, to experience it fully as it's passing through, without clinging. That's where the freedom is. And all of this leads us to the ultimate tool for navigating this incredibly tricky terrain. It's not about power, it's not about knowledge, it's all about humility. Now, we have to be clear. This is not about thinking less of yourself or having low self-esteem. True humility in this context is a powerful, strategic resolve. It's the quiet commitment to not build a new, shiny, spiritual identity out of the wreckage of your old one. It's about staying in that process of dismantling, not starting to rebuild. The Tao Te Ching gives us this perfect metaphor of water. Humility is about being fluid, being transparent, and being unwilling to freeze into any one fixed shape or identity. Water just nourishes everything by being what it is, without ever claiming any special status for itself. And finally, this powerful reminder from Al-Ghazali. The temptation is always going to be to get proud of our progress, of our virtue. But the real work is to let every single achievement, every good deed, actually deepen our humility instead of inflating our ego. And that leaves us with this final question to really chew on. On any path of growth, your greatest success can instantly become your biggest prison. The incredible insight you had yesterday can become the rigid ego you're defending today. So, the real question is, how will you stay humble? You've probably heard the term holy guardian angel before, right? It brings up some pretty specific, almost storybook images. But what if this ancient idea isn't about an external spirit at all? What if it's describing something way more personal and a lot more practical? When most of us hear guardian angel, this is probably what comes to mind. You know, some kind of benevolent winged being watching over us from above. It's a beautiful image, the one we've gotten from centuries of art and stories. But it's based on the idea that this guide is something separate from us. For the sake of this explainer, though, we're going to have to put that image aside. Because this isn't a story about a spirit from the heavens. We're going to dive into a much older and maybe even more powerful way of looking at this. And I mean really old. We're talking more than 2,000 years ago with the philosopher Socrates. He talked about his daemon, an inner voice that guided him. See, for him, this wasn't an angel up in the clouds. It was more like an internal compass that he trusted completely. And that's really our starting point. So let's try to reframe this whole thing. We're going to move away from the myth and the folklore and start looking at this guardian as a fundamental function of our own consciousness. To really get to the bottom of this, we have to peel back all those layers of romantic ideas and supernatural beliefs that have built up over time. The whole point here is to find the actual functional psychological mechanism that these old terms were really trying to describe. Okay, so if it's an internal compass, how does it actually show up? I mean, what's happening inside our own minds that allows this guidance to emerge once all the usual mental noise starts to die down? Now, this definition is really key. It calls the angel a transitional regulatory function. I know, that's a mouthful. But all it really means is that it's a temporary, self-correcting ability that pops up in our minds once we start getting rid of some of our confusion. It's not some other being. It's a sign of our own consciousness starting to mature. And here's what it feels like. It's like this quiet, steady signal, a deep intuition. It's just so different from that loud, chaotic back and forth we usually have in our heads that it often feels like it's coming from somewhere else, like a distinct voice that isn't our normal, everyday self. And this, right here, leads us to the biggest challenge of all. If we have this quiet inner guide, but we also have the loud voice of our ego, our habits, our fears, and our cravings, how on earth do you tell them apart? I mean, that's really the essential question, isn't it? When you've got these two competing voices pulling you in different directions, how do you know which one is the real guide and which one is just your ego wearing a clever disguise to get what it wants? Okay, let's break this down because the differences are stark. An ego impulse, that comes from our old programming, our conditioned habits, our cravings. But the guardian function, that comes from a place of genuine clarity and insight, and the tone is everything. The ego is loud, it's urgent, it's emotional. The guardian is quiet, persistent, and neutral. The ego is all about immediate gratification or defending itself. The guardian is about aligning with what's true. And check out this last part. If you say no to your ego, you feel anxiety or even rage. But if you ignore the guardian, you just feel off, a kind of quiet dissonance or sadness, like you know you've strayed from the path. So if you're going to remember one thing from all of this, let it be this distinction. The voice that's shouting, that's demanding your attention right now, that's almost always the ego. The real guidance is that quiet, steady whisper you can only hear when you actually stop and listen. And here are some huge red flags to watch out for. If that inner voice starts flattering you, telling you how special and important you are, if it claims you have some unique status that nobody else can understand, or if it demands that you obey it without question, that is not the guardian. That is the ego, plain and simple. True guidance never needs to flatter you, it just points the way. Okay, so if this true guiding signal is so quiet, how in the world do we learn to hear it more clearly? How do we turn up the volume? Well, this brings us to a really critical practice. The key is silence. And look, we're not just talking about finding a quiet place to sit. The source material is really clear on this point. At this stage in your development, silence isn't just a nice to have. It's a functional necessity. It is a required tool for the job. And here's why. First, when you talk about these really subtle inner experiences, you dissipate the energy you need to actually stabilize them. It's like letting all the air out of a tire. Second, when you start telling people, you start looking for their approval, their validation, and that takes this delicate flowing experience and hardens it into a rigid story, an identity. Oh, I'm the person who hears these voices. And finally, every time you try to put it into words, you distort the signal and you invite all these outside opinions that just create more noise. All right, now we get to the most counterintuitive, most surprising part of this whole process. What actually happens when you succeed? What's the end game here? I guarantee you the answer is not what you think. That's right. The entire point of cultivating this inner guide is for it to eventually vanish. I know, it sounds like a total paradox, but when you think it through, it's the only logical conclusion to the whole journey. Think about it for a second. The very experience of having a guide means there's a split inside you. It means there's a part of you that knows the way and another part of you that's lost and needs guiding. You've got a guider and you've got the guided. That feeling of separation, of duality, is just a temporary bridge. It only exists because there's a gap between what you're doing and what you know deep down is true. The guide is just the voice calling you to come across that bridge. So the guide's real purpose is to make itself obsolete. It's to work itself out of a job. Because when that gap finally closes, when your actions and your inner truth become one and the same, there's no need for a separate voice anymore. The inner argument is over. You don't hear the guide because you have become the guidance. And this quote from the mystic George Fox just captures it perfectly. The real goal isn't to have an ongoing conversation with an angel. The goal is the deep silence that comes when the internal conflict finally stops. It's about finding that pure, still place inside and finally being brought to rest. What does that kind of inner peace feel like? Now that's something worth thinking about. All right, today we are tackling a concept from Western esoteric traditions that sounds like the ultimate power trip, but as we're going to see, it might actually be the ultimate act of surrender. Master of the Temple. I mean, it just sounds huge, doesn't it? Really grandiose. You immediately picture someone with total control, incredible authority, maybe even some kind of supreme magical ability. But what if that's got nothing to do with it? What if we've got it all backwards? So let's really dig into this, because the reality is so much more subtle, and honestly, way more psychologically profound than the name lets on. We're going to unpack what this state of being is actually all about. Okay, so the first thing you have to get is that the title itself is almost a trap. Yeah, a test. It's designed to lure in the ego with this shiny promise of power. But the real work, the actual goal, has nothing to do with ruling over anything or anyone. And here is where that misunderstanding becomes crystal clear. On the one hand, you have the common idea of what a master is: dominion, power, special abilities. But the esoteric reality, it's the polar opposite. It's about perfecting the vessel, and that vessel is you, your own consciousness. And you do that by dismantling your identity and arriving at a place of, well, structural emptiness. It's not about gaining power, it's about achieving a state of profound purity. And this brings us to the most important metaphor for this entire idea, thinking of the human mind, your psyche, as a kind of temple. This ancient idea really gets to the core of it. The whole point isn't to build up this big defensive fortress of an ego. No, the point is to purify your own inner space so completely that it becomes a worthy vessel, a temple, ready for a much deeper understanding to come in. It's a process of finding total inner balance and clarity. And what's really crucial here is that a perfected temple isn't opaque. It's transparent. We're talking about a mind that has finally stopped doing that constant, exhausting job of defending a personal self. Instead, it just becomes this clean, clear space for perceiving reality as it is, without all the usual distortions. This leads to a really powerful shift in how you relate to your own mind. I mean, think about it for a second. Are you ruled by your thoughts, your emotions, your memories? All the furniture inside your head? Well, this state of mastery means you're not a servant to that stuff anymore. You're not pushed and pulled around by it. You are, for the first time, actually free. So if we had to boil it all down, here's what it is. Master of the Temple is a stable state where that constant, nagging impulse to relate everything back to me, my story, my problems, has just stopped. It's a profound quiet, a stable absence, not some new superpower you've acquired. But, and this is a big but, getting to this state of quiet is not some gentle, peaceful process. It demands a dramatic, life-altering ordeal known in this tradition as crossing the abyss. And we need to be absolutely clear about what this crossing is. It is not an achievement. It's not a trophy your ego gets to put on the shelf. It is not something the self can win. It is a catastrophe, a complete, total, and utter collapse of the person you believed you were. Everything you used to define yourself, your history, your personality, your successes, your failures, all of it is revealed to be just a story, a construct. And this gets to the wild paradox at the heart of it all. You can't just decide to cross the abyss, because the very you that wants to get to the other side is the one thing that has to be left behind. The bridge builder has to stop building for the crossing to happen. So what is this abyss, really? Think of it as the gap between your personal, story-driven self and a reality that isn't split into me versus everything else. It's that void you have to pass through where the ego, that sense of being a separate self, completely dissolves. So, after this, catastrophic event, what's left? What does this so-called emptiness on the other side actually look and feel like? Well, what comes out of this ordeal is sometimes called the babe of the abyss. Now, this isn't about becoming childish or immature. It's a symbol for a consciousness that is totally, radically open and vulnerable, simply because it's no longer carrying around the heavy baggage of a personal story. In the language of alchemy, this state is the perfected white stone. It means that the long process of purification, the albedo or the whitening, is finally done, and the result is a consciousness that is cool, meaning it's no longer inflamed by passions and compulsions. It's just reflective and completely receptive to what is. And while this all might sound super abstract, it's actually part of a very structured map of consciousness in certain systems. Now, please, don't worry about memorizing this table. Just look at the very last row. That's the key. The Master of the Temple grade lines up perfectly with a state called Bina, which means understanding, and it marks the completion of that alchemical whitening we just talked about. It's the end of a very long and difficult journey of purification. Now, that state, Bina, is often associated with sorrow, but this isn't personal sadness or depression. It's a deep, impersonal understanding and acceptance of the way things are, of the universal nature of suffering, but without the buffer of a personal ego that's constantly complaining about it. It's like feeling the weight of the world, but there's no self there to be crushed by it. So after all that, the purification, the catastrophe of identity, emerging into this profound emptiness, you'd think that's it, right? Mission accomplished, the final goal. Well, it's not. It's true that the work of whitening, of purifying the mind, is finished. The psyche has been purged of all its attachments and compulsions. That entire massive stage of the work is complete. And this leads us to the most important point of all. The temple is finally built. It's empty, it's clean, it's perfectly prepared. But you don't build a temple just for it to sit there, empty. The service, the real work, hasn't even started yet. This state, this mastery, isn't an end point. It's the real beginning. And we'll end on this powerful idea from the Heart Sutra. This purified emptiness isn't a void of nothingness. It's a state of profound freedom. Freedom from all the things that we use to build our identity. So the real question isn't about what's been lost. The real question is, what becomes possible for a consciousness that is finally free to act without a self to defend?